joining the conclusive finance ministers and central bank governors meeting under the G7 Italian presidency. We will have two presentations, one by Minister Giorgetti and the other one by the Italian central governor Panetta. And then we will have Q&A, but it should be very short because we don't have much time at our disposal. Thank you. Good morning to all of you. Over the past 2 days, here in Stresa, we addressed many different issues. The key highlights are of interest for the media, namely economic fragmentation. That was one of the key issues that was already put in the agenda according to the most recent evolutions and trends that proved and showed the new configuration of the economic globalization. And then AI, artificial intelligence, this is another key issue with the many aspects related to finance and economy, and we focus on the potential impacts and related risks. But of course, AI is a much broader question that will be addressed again during the leaders' meeting. And then international taxation, the global taxation. So you know that the deadline by which the first pillar on within the OECD framework that should be approved. And of course, you know that there are still problems to be leveled out. As for the amount B, namely the prerequisite for the approval of the pillar on the global taxation for big corporations. There is some resistance by a few countries, both at a political and technical level, that make it quite difficult to get to the finalization of this agreement. So there is no certainty about the global taxation decision. And another key issue refers to the following challenges, namely how the development banks and world international banks can provide their contribution to the more vulnerable countries in addition to the usual mission for the economic development and bridging this gap. There are many other missions that have to be met in order to allow and enable the various countries, including the less developed countries, to achieve the environmental goals. I know that these goals are not just ambitious for developed countries, but they are even more so for other countries that have to deal with other urgent matters. So when it comes to this very important issue, getting ready for future pandemics and other types of outbreaks and emergencies. And we also have the issue of resilience about supply chains. The central issue that has been covered so far, that is one of the most topical ones, is support to Ukraine, and in particular the use of the Russian frozen sovereign assets, or a better use of the proceeds coming from these assets. And that was quite a great success at a European level, namely the use by the EU of these revenues deriving from the present assets. As for the future proceeds, the future revenues deriving from the frozen assets to serve as a sort of bond to guarantee loans in favor of Ukraine so that it can be supported, that of course it will be in desperate need of money, and Minister Marchenko highlighted and confirmed it today, highlighting and insisting on this urgent matter so that we can therefore meet the requirements referred to the energy shortages. and we know where we are now with the stance by Russia. Progress has been made so far as far as the main issues are concerned, concerning how to use the proceeds, the revenues derived from Russian sovereign frozen assets. But of course, we have legal, technical issues that have to be overcome. And there's something that has been confirmed in the press release is the strong positioning in terms of a political stance by all the G7 countries. This is all on my side, and I would like to give the floor to Governor Panetta. Thank you, Giancarlo. The central banks have focused on economic and financial issues. A specific reference and survey was carried out concerning the global situation, the global economic and financial situation, with a view to the future, to what lies ahead. Generally speaking, we are satisfied in observing that the world economy, the global economy, proved to be resilient as against the previous years' restrictions as introduced by a few countries that was not to be taken for granted. But if we look around, there are a few signs of recovery. It is nothing exceptional, but anyway, these are shy signs of recovery at a global scale. Apart from the U.S. economy that is still going, that is experiencing an important growth, and the difference between the U.S. and the Euro area, the difference is productivity, which is the engine that fuels the long-term growth. In the United States, that occurred very rapidly, unlike other areas. As far as inflation is concerned, its trend is quite widespread. It is in a downward trend after a few peaks over the past few months, mainly due to the increase of energy prices. And these increases have been absorbed, and thanks to the intervention by central banks, and inflation is now going down. Maybe not in a uniform way. Maybe we are a bit better positioned as against the U.S. when there is more resistance in bringing inflation down, but that is the general trend. We're going back to normal stability of prices as the central banks would define it. And then we also discussed the various financial disabilities and gaps to be bridged. As for financial stability, the risks have been reduced because the credit crunch didn't have this impact, and also because geopolitical shocks have also been sort of absorbed. So there has been an improvement from this point of view. Furthermore, as against the past, we talked about the non-banking intermediaries, and risks were mainly focused and concentrated at the bank level, but there has been a shift. And given the dimension and the non-banking intermediaries' position has increased as against banks. So there are many factors, many reasons for that, many drivers. After the financial crisis 10 years ago, there has been a re-regulation of the banking system, and that has led to greater stability, to greater attention to assets, coefficients, and so this did not really concern the non-banking intermediaries and the work that remains to be done. There are many pending issues, namely capital adequacy, and so on and so forth, but this is the work to be done over the next few months. And then when we talk about finance and financial intermediaries, that means talking about technology. And technology brings risks along. We have heard about cybernetic risks and threats, and this is a growing risk that concerns and affects all the various countries. And a discussion was held about a stress exercise so that the various G7 institutions have sort of taken stock of the situation to see what their performance would be should a cybernetic attack occur. And that concerned Italy as well as Banca d'Italia. At the end, there was a general degree of satisfaction concerning the performance of these financial institutes. It was self-assessed, but we are quite happy about the final and good result. And then payments. That was another topic that was addressed in the past. That was one of the issues that was of a minor details and maybe boring, but it is no longer so because payment and financial infrastructures has now become a central issue that takes center stage also in geopolitical discussions, because the most effective weapon that advanced countries have exerted after the invasion by Russia of Ukraine is the weapon of sanctions, so that the financial infrastructures were the tools, the weapons that were used by the reserve currency issuers, namely euro and dollars. The fact of having efficient infrastructures that do guarantee such a capability of regulating the market and taking action on the financial system is something that shouldn't be neglected and that requires attention, and so that this issue is in the limelight in the various countries and in the G20 as a whole. And then payments. Payments, too, are a great inclusiveness issue. There are so many emerging low-income countries that are still marginalized in terms of international payments. You've got countries that really count on immigrants' revenues, and you see remittances, but it can cost 10% or more on average of the transfer of money that is therefore provided by immigrants, providing this money back home. If there were a delocalization of a company in an advanced country, there should be a flow of money, of transfers from back and forth. And if the money transfer costs were so high, it would be impossible and no longer affordable. And so we are working on the issue of remittances. This is part of the G20 agenda, and this kind of issue has been there for is now under discussion, and this agenda is now being prepared by the Financial Stability Board. And this is one of the priorities, and the results of the Financial Stability Board will be discussed during the G7 and G20 frameworks. And that's all on my part. Thank you.
Alessandro Barbera, La Stampa newspaper. Waiting for the microphone. Good morning, Minister and Governor. I would like to ask something to the Minister. This morning, before the session began, he met with the colleagues of France and Germany. I asked you, what did you discuss? What did you talk about? Did you also talk about how to liaise with the United States on a topic which Washington's decisions to impose custom duties on Chinese products risks having an important impact on European markets, especially in the car sector? Well, we talked about the position vis-à-vis the United States stance on Russian assets. And we also, as I said before, we talked about China's overcapacity and how it affects everyone, the United States, Europe. And it is obvious that the stance taken by the United States too has some effects, some consequences on our market as well. Consequently, the discussion, as you can see in the conclusions, which we have shared with other G7 countries, of starting cooperation and exchange of views in terms of trade, tech, and fire strike. This is a subject matter, a topic that cannot be addressed by finance ministers only, but it needs to be addressed by the relevant ministers that deal with foreign trade. So, as you can see, it is a sphere, a sector that is definitely covered by Europe. It is undeniable that there are different points of views as to how address this issue, taking into account the possible retaliations that China could resort to when faced with such measures. Roberto Wozzi, Asca News, for Governor Panetta, and Veronica Gervaso of TG5 Television News will be next. Good morning. Thank you, Governor. You mentioned a debate on payment systems. You were in charge of the Euro Digital at the ECB, and the Federal Reserve is here represented, even though the governor is not here. Did you talk between you, the governors, about the possibility of carrying on with developing of digital currencies in central banks? And for the Euro system, if in the United States there were no digital dollar, could that be a problem in pursuing the digital euro? Well, we talked about currency, digital currency. We did not talk about the digital euro. This was a G7 meeting, not a Eurosystem meeting. But there is no nexus between the United States' decision to introduce the digital dollar when it comes to a decision that in the Eurosystem is only about the euro. The euro is not thought of for the U.S. The euro, the digital euro, is thought up to be digital currency in a world that is becoming more digital. So the payments that European citizens make are more and more digital. And it's their own choice. Secondly, trade is changing too. It has become an online trade. It accounts for a growing share of trade. So if these two trends will carry on this way, if citizens will resort to paper money less and less and make more online purchases, we could face a paradoxical situation. Monetary union that does not have its own currency. There will only be the currency of investment banks, of retail banks. There will be online payment systems, but there will be no single currency for paying across the entire area. And this is hard to accept for a central bank. So we are trying to do all we can to give citizens what is a public asset, because we drink, we eat, we sleep, and we pay. That's what we do on a daily basis. So if there is no public currency, it will be difficult to pay. Another thing we do is die, but that's something that happens once. Paying is something we do every day. So that's a service that central banks provide to the citizens. They provide a safe, secure payment system that has no risks, that works well, and that is cheap. Because such an important public good cannot be out of the control of the public authority. It must not be a public monopoly, but this payment system requires central banks. Veronica Gervaso, TG5 News, for Minister Giorgetti. Enrico Piovan, ANSA Press Agency, is next. The microphone. Russian assets, using Russian frozen assets to support Ukraine. Could you further detail this? Well, the agreement is a political one. The details are a substantial part of the whole issue because, as you know, these revenues, these extra earnings are mainly to be found in Europe. So we must adjust to the European regulation in terms of the possible use of these extra earnings. The success that was obtained last week, I believe, was a huge step forward. The original proposal that came from the U.S., namely that the loan be managed by the U.S. with resources for collateral for Europe. This implies an agreement within the G7. There are three important European countries in the G7, but there are 27 European member states, and we have considered involving all countries taking part that are members of the euro area. We will be working over the next weeks on this in order to hammer out some sort of proposal by mid-June, by the G7 leaders meeting. It is not an easy task, but we are working very hard on it. All the G7 members are working very hard on it. Enrica Piovan, ANSA press agency for the Minister and Governor. Cabrini from CNBC is next. Good morning. In the latest recommendations of the IMF, the Italian economy seems to be recovering, but basically the fund also suggests cutting the tax wedge, focusing rather on the tax wedge on permanent solutions for labor. So I would like to know your point of view, since your government has always focused a lot on cutting the tax wedge. For the governor, everyone expects from the next ECB meeting in June a slash of the rates, and I would like to know if possibly this might not happen. Now, regarding the contribution of the IMF, well, it agrees on the reduction of the tax wedge. It asks us to make an extra effort and take a proactive stance vis-à-vis the main driver of economic growth, which the governor mentioned. And this calls for a coordination with a greater tax reform that has started and should be fully rolled out next year. I think I'm saying nothing new if I say that I am convinced there are the grounds, the conditions for an adjustment of monetary policy. Inflation is going down on all its elements, in all its components. The inflation risks are going down as well. So what emerges, I believe, is a general consensus on the possibility of cutting rates. You know that the main concept of the euro system is meeting by meeting. That's how the euro system proceeds. Nothing must hinder the possible outcome of the meeting. What matters, what is interesting, is that now this consensus is growing stronger, is growing broader, and even those who had doubts in the past as to the need to modify monetary conditions are beginning to agree. Andrea Cabrini, CNBC. Giuseppe Fonte from Reuters is next. Good morning, Minister and Government. Minister, I wanted to ask you, in a nutshell, taking stock of this three-day event, what can you say? What kind of expectations did you have? What kind of progress have we made looking at the G7 Leaders Summit in June? And how did the Italian mediation make the difference in drafting the final document? Governor, what emerged during the meeting with the governors of the central banks today, especially regarding trade-related tensions, custom duties, trade war possibilities? All this has an impact on inflation and economic growth that might affect monetary policy as well. I believe that this G7 has contributed in highlighting a number of issues that were being followed. Fragmentation of global markets, financial assets, frozen financial assets, artificial intelligence and its consequences. And for the first time, there was a very open and very honest debate as to these elements. It would be arrogant if I were to say that my role, or Italy's role, is crucial, is pivotal. But it is true that if we look back to one year ago, looking at these problems, perhaps we were right in considering them. Well, we didn't need mediation when it comes to the documents, because they were drafted properly by the Bank of Italy and by the Finance Ministry. So the result, in my opinion, is indeed very positive. Today, we talked about payments. We talked about this very important issue of international payments, which, as I said, is no longer a niche topic. It is a topic that borders with geopolitics and foreign policy. So the central banks of the G7, the central banks are the institutions that in each country manage payments and work to make infrastructure increasingly efficient. So the central banks of the G7 exchanged thoughts as to how to better achieve the goals of the G20. So obtain an international payment system that works properly, that is low cost, that is reliable, and that is safe. Regarding inflation, we have addressed the topic together with the ministers. What you mentioned, trade-related tensions, fragmentation of the global economy, that's something that in the medium and long run will affect inflation. But what will happen to inflation over the next 6 to 12 months, that's what the central banks are focusing on, is exactly what we are focusing on right now. This is something we are currently discussing, and in 1 year's time, I will be able to give you an update. Giuseppe Conte from Reuters for the minister, then Filippo Santelli, Repubblica newspaper. Good morning, Minister. The European Commission will have to decide by the early June whether to introduce custom duties on Chinese electric vehicles. Does Italy agree with this idea of imposing custom duties? And then I have a second question for both. The ECB is putting pressure on European banks in order for them to reduce their activities in Russia. So what kind of role is the government and the Bank of Italy playing in this regard? Thank you.
In my opinion, the customs duties is a reality. It is not a political choice. It is an objective fact. With the Inflation Reduction Act, the United States, when they started this kind of policy, they really introduced this new issue for the EU. They should reflect and understand what to do in cases like this, because we Europeans and Italians, we would pay twice. This competitiveness or competition disadvantage, not just with the Chinese, but also with the U.S. companies. Filippo Santelli for the minister and the governor, and then Vittorio Evoli, Sky TG24. Thank you. I've got a question for both of you. So a question concerning the anticipation of the revenue deriving from frozen assets, frozen Russian assets. If I well understood, Mr. Minister, the American proposal would be for them to issue a loan using European resources, assets. Can you please be more precise about it? Or who would provide a collateral, a guarantee for this kind of loan? As for the question to the governor, since we've talked about a few perplexities by the central banks concerning this proposal, can you please tell us what the doubts are and what are the guarantees that would push the central bankers to opt for this solution? Okay, the initiative on Russian assets, namely the revenues deriving from frozen assets, is to use that money to cover the state deficit. I'm not referring to military expenses for Ukraine. Then, as Mrs. Yellen said, the Treasury Secretary from the U.S., her proposal is flexible and pragmatic because it would, of course, use the legal reserves for regulation of the EU that would be an ad hoc instrument, an ad hoc governance instrument to manage this kind of loan. The proposal has been tabled, has been submitted by the U.S., but the U.S. is also aware that we need to cooperate to get to a result, namely the desperate need, as the Ukraine Minister Marchenko said, to cover the deficit requirements of Ukraine over the next few months. As for the central banks, they do not have any doubts or perplexities, but they highlighted two main considerations to be taken into account before the decision is made about the use of revenues deriving from the Russian frozen assets. First of all, to have a solid legal basis. It would be paradoxical if we violated the international law by then blaming the Russians for not behaving in a lawful way. So such a thing should never happen. Secondly, we should take into account advantages and disadvantages deriving from this measure. So a part of the burdens related to the financing of war in Ukraine would be funded by this flow of money. But there would be repercussions on international monetary system, and there would be, as a consequence, a weakening of a very important weapon to be used by central banks in guaranteeing the rule of law and international law in the future. So this possibility of using these revenues should be taken into account carefully, thoroughly, because this is a strength, and it should be managed with wisdom. Vittorio Eboli, Sky TG24. A question to the Minister. Good morning, Minister. Good morning to all of you. As for relationships with China, you mentioned the fact that governments are showing a way, and big corporation managers are also exploring other avenues, like, for example, when it comes to electric cars. So are they two different approaches to have a wall, sort of wall being built, or are we looking for another proposal, or is there a way that these two possibilities might be taken into account? The policymakers pursue the collective good. The companies pursue profit-making for companies. And now Sky News journalist and then Sara Pichichi from Milano Finanza. Scutiero Labref. And now I've got a question to Minister Giorgetti, if among the various options that are being studied, you also have the World Bank that is ready to manage this fund. Is it a concrete possibility? And to the Governor Panetta, have you talked about the health status with various other central governors? And what about any criticalities? Yes, the World Bank's proposal is one of the things that we are now taking into account as a possibility. Yes, we did talk about the state of health of the financial system as a whole. And as I already mentioned, banks have an asset and financial position which is quite strong, and that depends on quite a few factors, because after the financial crisis, the reaction by the international community of governments and central banks was focused on reviewing the rules in order to get rid of the weaknesses and the gaps that led to all the events that took place 10 years ago that might be referred to as a financial crisis. So some of these recipes were right, and the problems have been solved, but who knows? Doesn't mean that we won't have any problems in the future. But we can say that the financial system is solid, robust in terms of capital adequacy and stability. And after the pandemic and after the energy crisis and after the war, if we had a weak financial system, we would have had a problem, a further problem. But this time, the banking financial system proved to be strong enough. And now, Bocchicchi, Milano Finanza, Minister, Governor, my question to you concerns AI, artificial intelligence, and in particular, its application on the financial system, because we know that the widespread use of these systems might revolutionize and impact the trends of financial markets. So my question is whether over the past 2 days, AI has been discussed, and what the G7 decided to do. What is your proposal about it? Well, as far as we are concerned, we addressed a couple of issues, aspects. First of all, the impact on productivity on the one hand, and on the labor market on the other hand. Secondly, G7 meeting and all the other sessions where other countries joined, it is unavoidable to disregard AI, but it might even increase gaps in the world rather than narrowing it. It takes a lot of energy and power to process data in AI. If in Africa they don't even have power to cook or to cater for basic needs, how can you think that AI might be a positive factor? So there are many questions that may arise apart from the geopolitical use or misuse of AI, but that requires a further meeting. As for the impact on the financial system, the application of AI in the financial system might lead to increase of efficiency and performance, because repetitive routine operations might be carried out by AI, because there's so much big quantity of data that might be processed in much better and more rapid way. But on the other hand, there might be a bad impact. For example, various investors might use these tools, these instruments related to AI, and have better and deeper insight for investment decisions to be made. So this is a question that supervisory authorities have to take into account, and these issues are already tabled and are discussed on a daily basis by our system. Paola Bonanni, GRI, and then Schubert Watz. Mr. Minister, Mr. Governor, I've got a question for both of you. The topics that have been addressed so far during this summit, as you said earlier on, will these issues further discussed in Apulia's meeting? in the leaders' meeting. Yes, of course. That goes without saying when it comes to the issue related to the use of income deriving from Russian frozen assets, and also the help towards third countries. And these issues will be further discussed during the leaders' summit. Yes, my answer is yes. I don't know what the summit agenda is, so I have nothing to add. Christian Schubert and then Alessandra Migliaccio, Bloomberg. Good morning. I have a question concerning international tax agreements. Are there problems with Pillar 1, right? But what about the true problems? In the past, you talked about countries like India that really prevented such a trend to go on. Where are we? We are in a stalemate, in a deadlock. We really hope that we can do any better. A lot depends on the transparent definition of rules of the game as for this kind of approach. India put let's say, resisted against it, but also China, and the June deadline might run the risk of being met. Failed, yes, that's what that was the word I was looking for. Now, Migliaccio, Bloomberg, and then Financial Times representative. Thank you.
Volevo sapere, prima si parlava di inflazione e crescita all'inizio, mi chiedevo se avevate anche...
Have you also talked about debt? That is a common issue for all the G7 countries. I'm not just referring to Italy, but to the general issue. Indebtedness is highest during time of peace. Is something that you have talked about, and is a question of concern. I mean, we didn't discuss it directly, but let's say that it is pervasive in any kind of discussion we hold. So indebtedness is an issue when it comes to the various emerging situations in more vulnerable countries. That is an issue that comes to the forefront, especially because of the inability to repay debts and the difficult position that these countries find themselves in. Financial Times, and then Geraldo Graziola, Radio Cora. Thank you. A question for the Minister. As for the agreement of principle on the frozen assets from Russia, is it based on the income based in Belgium, or that concerns all the other European countries? That is a consolidated principle. During the discussions we had over the past few days, everyone has to do one's bit to give one's contribution. Europe on its side, likewise Japan and the UK also committed itself. Canada committed itself in that way. And so the proposal will be under the G7 label. Just because it is a G7 labeled, branded proposal, there should be an agreement about the use of the income deriving from frozen assets. Radio Cor, and then Gregorio Sorci. Thank you, Mr. Minister. My question concerns privatization. Do you think that we should continue with the same modality as for NPS, or should you find another anchor investor? But what about a problem emerged? Maybe Cassa Depositi would intervene. As for that is a good suggestion of Cassa Depositi for Italy. We will think about it. We hadn't talked about it yet. When you refer to Cassa Depositi, it's the control fund and deposit institution. So In addition to the state-controlled funds, we are trying and making all our best efforts to do bailout, but it is also an evidence of solidity and robustness of the Italian banking system that shouldn't be underestimated, and that has been acknowledged internationally. Sorgi, Politico, and then last question, Alessandro Marchetti.
Good evening, Minister. I have another question regarding Russian assets. The Americans are very optimistic as to the possibility of striking a deal within the G7 during the G7 meeting in Apulia. You said there are several difficulties, plus we don't know what other European countries might think of it. Do you think it is reasonable to think that there might be an agreement to be reached in just 3 weeks' time, or would it all be postponed? I would say that optimism is driven by common will. We must be optimistic, we must work together and focus on that, and we must not give in when facing some objective difficulties. But these difficulties, when it comes to the second step that we recently resolved after 4 years of intense technical and political talks, well, this has led to a positive outcome. We know there are problems, but we are very determined in reaching a solution. Marchetti? Good morning. I too would like to touch on national issues with Minister Giorgetti. Over the last 48 hours, the decree on real estate and constructions has been converted into law. And Orsini from Confindustria asked the government to sit at a table to find a solution. So what do you have to say about this? And for Governor Panetta, recently, we have learned that Italian banks in Russia, their accounts have been seized. So this was some sort of retaliation. So all tribunals have issued rulings linked to sanctions. Do you think there might be problems for Italian companies and banks in Russia in the light of this? Well, with the last law decree, we finally overcame the super bonus for construction. Problem has been overcome. We have come back on planet Earth after a trip to Mars. I can tell Orsini this. Today, on the 25th of May, 2024, that's right, because 2025 might be something else. So in terms of real estate renovation and building renovation in Italy, well, the conditions for doing this is still very, very convenient. I talked about this with my colleagues just a few minutes ago, and I am pleased to acknowledge that even those who previously defended and supported the super bonus is now criticizing it. Now, the sound is not very good. Well, you asked me something about the banks that have branches in Russia, that operate in Russia. When the government decides that something is not to be done, that thing is not to be done. There are sometimes some objective problems because leaving Russia, which is a bit peculiar as a market, is somewhat complicated, and this means that it is a gradual thing. A process must be followed. You cannot just suddenly leave. You must find a buyer. But if you need to find a buyer, then that's not going to be easy. And there is also a reputation risk related problem. It can be costly because administrators, managers must reduce costs as much as possible. But bottom line, it's up to the governments, and we must pull out. We have finished. Thank you. I hope that just as our foreign colleagues have. I hope you have enjoyed your stay in Stresa.